The dust cloud rising behind the mail stage was barely visible when Sarah Patterson's mare stumbled for the third time in as many miles. And this time, the animal didn't recover its stride. Sarah felt the shift in the horse's gait immediately, that sickening hitch that every rider dreaded, and her heart sank faster than the Wyoming sun dropping toward the horizon. She dismounted quickly, her traveling dress catching on the saddle horn, and knelt beside the mare's right foreleg. The swelling around the fetlock told her everything she needed to know. They were 15 miles from Lusk, with maybe 2 hours of daylight left, and her horse was lame. "Easy, girl," Sarah murmured, running her hand down the mare's neck. The animal's dark eyes rolled with pain and confusion. Sarah stood and turned in a slow circle, surveying the emptiness that stretched in every direction. The road to Lusk was little more than a rutted trail cutting through sagebrush and prairie grass, and she hadn't seen another traveler since leaving the relay station that morning. It was September of 1883, and while Wyoming territory had been tamed enough for a woman to travel alone during daylight hours, being stranded on foot was another matter entirely. She could feel panic rising in her chest like floodwater, cold and suffocating. Her father lay sick in Lusk, possibly dying according to the telegram that had reached her in Cheyenne 3 days ago. She'd sold nearly everything she owned to afford the train fare and the horse, scraping together enough money to make this desperate journey. And now this. Sarah retrieved her canteen and poured water into her cupped palm, offering it to the mare. The horse drank gratefully, and Sarah felt tears sting her eyes. It wasn't the animal's fault. The mare was a good creature, just unlucky, like Sarah herself seemed to be lately. The sound of hoofbeats brought her head up sharply. For a moment she felt a spike of fear, remembering the stories she'd heard about road agents and drifters. But as the rider crested the low rise behind her, she saw he was leading a second horse. A working cowboy by the look of him, with dusty leather chaps, a worn hat pulled low, and a red bandana tied around his neck. He reined in his horse about 20 feet away, respectful of her space, and pushed his hat back. Sarah found herself looking at a sun-weathered face with honest brown eyes, and a jawline covered in several days' worth of dark stubble. "Afternoon, madam," he said, his voice low and careful. "Looks like you've got some trouble there." "My horse is lame," Sarah said, hating how her voice trembled. "I'm trying to reach Lusk before nightfall. My father is sick." The cowboy dismounted in one fluid motion and approached slowly, giving Sarah time to step back if she wanted to. She didn't. There was something about his manner that felt safe, respectful. He handed her his reins without a word and moved to examine her mare, his hands gentle as he felt down the injured leg. "Strained tendon," he said after a moment. "She needs rest and cold water treatment. Won't be carrying anyone for a week at least, maybe 2. He straightened and looked at Sarah directly. "Where did you say you were headed?" "Lusk. My father runs the telegraph office there, or he did until he took sick. I received word he's asking for me." The cowboy was silent for a long moment, studying her face. Sarah wondered what he saw. A woman of 23 with auburn hair coming loose from its pins, green eyes probably red from the dust and the threat of tears, a traveling dress that had once been fine but was now showing its age. She wondered if he could see the desperation she felt. "Name's Will Xerxes," he said finally. "Most folks call me Will. Sarah Patterson." "Well, Miss Patterson, I can't in good conscience leave you stranded out here. Sun will be down in a few hours and the temperature drops fast this time of year." "I know," Sarah said quietly. "I grew up in Wyoming. I just don't know what to do. I need to reach my father." Will looked at his own horse, then at the mare, then back at Sarah. She watched something shift in his expression, saw him come to a decision that looked like it cost him something to make. "You take my horse," he said. "I'll lead your mare behind me and walk alongside. We'll make it to Lusk before full dark if we start now and keep a steady pace." Sarah stared at him. "You would walk, that's 15 miles. I've walked further, and I've got good boots." He glanced down at his worn leather boots as if to prove the point. "Your need is greater than my comfort, Miss Patterson. I couldn't possibly ask you to do that. You didn't ask. I'm offering." His tone was firm but kind. "And we're burning daylight standing here arguing about it." Sarah felt something crack open in her chest, some hard shell she'd built up over the past few years of struggling alone in Cheyenne. This stranger was offering her a kindness she didn't deserve, couldn't repay, and desperately needed. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't know how to repay such generosity. No repayment needed, just common decency." We'll move to gather her mare's reins, checking the saddle and tightening a strap. "Can you ride astride? It'll be faster and easier on the horse." Sarah hesitated only a moment before nodding. Her traveling dress would allow it if she wasn't too concerned about propriety, and right now getting to her father mattered more than what anyone might think of her. Will helped her mount his horse, a sturdy bay gelding with a calm temperament. Then he took the mare's reins in one hand and started walking, setting a brisk pace that ate up the ground. Sarah watched him from atop his horse, this stranger who had traded his comfort for hers without hesitation. "You said you grew up in Wyoming," Will said after they'd been walking for about 10 minutes. "Where at?" "South Pass City originally," Sarah replied. "My father worked the telegraph during the mining days. When things slowed down there, we moved around. He's been in Lusk for about 5 years now." "I've been in Cheyenne, working." "Working at what, if you don't mind my asking?" "I was a teacher. Had a position at a private school for girls." She paused. "Had being the important word. I had to leave when I got the telegram about my father. They gave the position to someone else." "That's rough. Teaching's good, honest work. What about you, Mr. Xerxes? Where are you headed?" "Just Will, please. I was heading to Lusk myself, actually. Been working a cattle drive up from Colorado. We finished up near Cheyenne, and I've got wages in my pocket and a notion to head north. Heard they're hiring ranch hands near Sundance. That's quite a ways from Lusk. Well, I'm in no particular hurry, and now I've got a reason to see Lusk proper." He glanced up at her with a small smile. "Make sure you get to your father safely." They fell into a comfortable rhythm after that, the only sounds the crunch of boots on dirt, the soft plod of hooves, and the evening wind whistling through the sagebrush. Sarah found herself studying Will as he walked. He moved with the easy grace of someone used to long days and hard work, his stride never faltering despite the miles. She noticed things about him: the careful way he handled her injured mare, the straightness of his back despite what must have been growing fatigue, the way he scanned the horizon periodically like he was reading the landscape. "You have family?" Sarah asked as the sun sank lower, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. "Had a brother. He died in a riding accident 3 years back. Parents passed when I was young. It's just been me for a while now. I'm sorry. Life's like that sometimes. You lose people. But you keep going because that's what they'd want." He adjusted his grip on the mare's reins. "Your father, is he all you've got?" "Yes. My mother died when I was 16, cholera. After that it was just Pa and me until I moved to Cheyenne for the teaching position. I thought I was making a life for myself there, but now—" She trailed off, not sure how to explain the feeling of everything falling apart. "Now you're heading home," Will finished for her. "Nothing wrong with that. Sometimes we need to go back before we can move forward." The wisdom in his simple words struck Sarah deeply. She'd been so focused on getting away, on making something of herself independent of her father, that she'd forgotten about the ties that mattered. And now those ties were pulling her back, possibly too late. What if I don't make it in time? The words burst out of her before she could stop them. What if he dies before I get there? Will stopped walking and looked up at her. In the fading light, his eyes were kind and steady. Then you'll know you did everything you could to reach him. That mare going lame, that wasn't in your control. But you're doing what you can with what you've got. That's all any of us can do. Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to speak. They continued on as the sky darkened from pink to purple to deep blue. Will pulled out a small lantern from his saddlebag and lit it, letting the yellow glow guide their way. The temperature dropped as he'd predicted, and Sarah was grateful for the shawl she'd packed. "Are you cold?" she called down to him. "I'm fine. Walking keeps the blood moving." But she noticed he'd pulled his bandana up higher around his neck and hunched his shoulders slightly against the wind. On impulse, Sarah reached into her bag and pulled out a thick knitted scarf her father had given her last winter. "Here," she said, holding it out. "Please. You gave me your horse. The least I can do is help keep you warm." Will hesitated, then took the scarf with a nod of thanks. He wrapped it around his neck, and Sarah felt a small measure of satisfaction at being able to offer him something in return for his kindness. They walked on through the darkness, and Sarah found herself talking more than she had in months. There was something about the night, the steady rhythm of their travel, and Will's quiet presence that loosened her tongue. She told him about her students in Cheyenne, the little girls who'd struggled with their letters until Sarah found ways to make learning fun. She told him about the landlady who'd been kind to her, and the baker who'd sometimes slip her day-old bread at a discount. She told him about missing Wyoming's wide open spaces, even though Cheyenne was still in Wyoming, still had plenty of space. It was different somehow, being in a city compared to the small town she'd grown up in. Will shared his own stories in turn. Tales of cattle drives and long nights under the stars, of ornery steers and good horses, of the other cowboys he'd worked with, and the ranches he'd seen. He had a way of talking that made even the hard parts of his life sound like adventures rather than hardships. "You must love it," Sarah said. "The cowboy life. It's the only life I know, and yeah, I love it, the freedom of it mostly. Being able to move where the work is, sleep under the stars, answer to nothing but the land and the cattle." He paused. "Gets lonely sometimes, though, always moving on, never putting down roots." "Have you ever wanted to put down roots, I mean?" "Sometimes, but that takes more than just wanting, takes the right place, the right circumstances, the right person." He said this last part quietly, almost like he was talking to himself. They crested a rise, and suddenly there were lights in the distance. Lusk, small and scattered but unmistakably a town, spread out before them like a handful of stars fallen to earth. "There," Will said, and Sarah heard the relief in his voice. "We made it with time to spare." Sarah felt her heart leap and sink at the same time. Relief at reaching her destination warred with fear of what she might find there. And underneath both those feelings was something else, something she didn't want to examine too closely. Disappointment that this journey with Will was ending. They made their way down into the town, past darkened storefronts and a few saloons still spilling light and noise into the street. Will seemed to know where he was going, leading them directly to a building with a sign reading Lusk Telegraph Office, and beside it a small house with a lamp burning in the window. "That's it," Sarah said, her voice tight. "That's my father's house." She dismounted quickly, almost stumbling in her haste. Will caught her elbow, steadying her. "Thank you," Sarah said, turning to face him. "Thank you for everything. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't come along. You would have figured something out." "You're stronger than you think, Miss Patterson." He smiled at her, and even in the lamplight from the window she could see the warmth in his eyes. "Go on now. Go see your father." Sarah wanted to say more, wanted to find words adequate to express her gratitude, but Will was already leading both horses away toward what looked like a livery stable down the street. She watched him go for just a moment, then turned and hurried to the door. Her knock was answered by a plump woman with graying hair and a worried expression. "Yes, I'm Sarah Patterson. I'm here to see my father, Thomas Patterson. I received a telegram saying he was ill." The woman's face transformed with relief. "Oh, thank heavens. He's been asking for you constantly." "I'm Mabel Hughes, your father's neighbor. I've been sitting with him. Come in, come in." Sarah followed Mabel into the small house, her heart pounding. The main room was tidy but showed signs of a sick person's presence. A blanket draped over a chair, medicine bottles on the table, a basin of water. Mabel led her to a bedroom where Sarah's father lay in bed, looking smaller and older than she remembered. "Pa," Sarah whispered, moving to his bedside. Thomas Patterson's eyes opened, and for a moment they were clouded with confusion. Then recognition dawned and tears spilled down his weathered cheeks. "Sarah, my girl, you came." "Of course I came, Pa." Sarah knelt beside the bed and took his hand. It felt thin and fragile in hers. "How are you feeling?" "Better now that you're here." "I was afraid I wouldn't get to see you again to tell you I'm sorry." "Sorry for what?" "For not being a better father. For letting you go off to Cheyenne alone. For not visiting, not writing more often. I just wanted you to have your own life, but I should have made more effort." "Pa, no. You were a wonderful father. Are a wonderful father, and I'm the one who should apologize. I got so caught up in my own life that I forgot what mattered most." They talked for over an hour, Sarah holding her father's hand the whole time. Mabel brought tea and eventually excused herself, promising to return in the morning. The doctor, she explained, had been by earlier and said Thomas had pneumonia but seemed to be past the worst of it. With rest and care, he should recover. The relief Sarah felt at those words was overwhelming. She hadn't been too late. Her father would live. Eventually, Thomas drifted off to sleep, breathing more easily than he had when she first arrived. Sarah sat in a chair by his bed, too wired to sleep herself, her mind racing over everything that had happened. And inevitably, her thoughts returned to Will. She wondered where he was now. Had he found a room at a boarding house? Was he at the saloon having a drink after his long walk? Or was he already preparing to leave Lusk to continue his journey north? The thought of him leaving without her seeing him again created a hollow feeling in her chest, which was ridiculous. She'd known him for only a few hours, and yet those hours had felt more real, more honest than weeks spent in polite society back in Cheyenne. The next morning, after ensuring her father was comfortable and his breakfast was eaten, Sarah made her way to the telegraph office. The current operator, a young man named Henry, was thrilled to see her and immediately offered to show her the books and explain what had been happening in her father's absence. "Truth is, Miss Patterson, I'm not very good at this," Henry admitted. "I make mistakes with the code and people get frustrated. I've just been filling in because there was no one else. If you know how to operate the telegraph, it would be a blessing." "My father taught me when I was young," Sarah said. "I'm a bit rusty, but I think I can manage." She spent the morning reacquainting herself with the equipment and the rhythms of the office. It felt good to be useful, to have a purpose. But part of her attention was always elsewhere, listening for the door, hoping to see a particular tall cowboy walk through it. It was early afternoon when Will finally appeared. He'd cleaned up, shaved, and was wearing the same clothes but somehow looked different. More settled, maybe. He held his hat in his hands and offered Sarah a tentative smile. "Afternoon, Miss Patterson. I wanted to check on you, see how your father was doing." Sarah's heart did something complicated in her chest. He's doing much better, thank you. The doctor says he should make a full recovery, and please call me Sarah. I think we're past formalities after yesterday. Sarah, then. And I'm glad to hear about your father. That's real good news. Will shifted his weight, looking uncertain for the first time since she'd met him. I also wanted to return your scarf and to check on your mare. I brought her to the livery last night, and the owner's been treating that leg. He thinks she'll be right as rain in a week or so. That's wonderful, but you didn't have to come all the way here to tell me. You could have sent word. I know, but I wanted to see you. He said it simply, honestly, and Sarah felt heat rise to her cheeks. If that's all right. It's more than all right. They stood there for a moment, just looking at each other, and Sarah felt the same connection she'd sensed during their nighttime journey. It was like recognizing something she hadn't known she'd been searching for. Would you like to have dinner with me tonight? Will asked. There's a restaurant here in town, nothing fancy, but the food's supposed to be decent. I'd like that very much, but I should warn you I need to stay close to my father right now. He's still weak. Of course. What if I brought food to you? We could eat at your father's house, and you'd be right there if he needed anything. Sarah smiled. That sounds perfect. We'll return that evening with a basket of food from the restaurant, fried chicken and biscuits and green beans cooked with bacon. Sarah had tidied the house and checked on her father, who was awake and alert and very curious about who was coming to visit. A cowboy who helped you on the road, Thomas said, his eyes twinkling despite his illness. Sounds like something out of a dime novel. Pa, don't start. I'm not starting anything. I'm just saying it's nice that someone looked out for my daughter. I'd like to meet this fellow and thank him properly. When Will arrived, Thomas insisted on getting out of bed and joining them at the table, though Sarah made him sit in the most comfortable chair with extra pillows. Will shook Thomas's hand with genuine respect and listened attentively as the older man thanked him for helping Sarah. Any decent man would have done the same, Will said, but Thomas shook his head. Not every man is decent, son, and not every decent man would have walked 15 miles just to help a stranger. That says something about your character. The three of them shared the meal, conversation flowing easily. Thomas asked Will about his work, and Will asked Thomas about the telegraph business. Sarah watched the two men talk and felt something warm and right settle in her chest. Her father approved of Will. She could see it in his eyes, hear it in his voice. After dinner, Will helped Sarah wash the dishes while Thomas dozed in his chair. They worked side by side, Sarah washing and Will drying, their hands occasionally brushing in the warm, soapy water. Your father's a good man, Will said quietly. You're lucky to have him, I know. I almost forgot that, living away from him, but being back here I remember. Are you going to stay, in Lusk, I mean? Sarah paused, her hands still in the water. I don't know, I don't have anything to go back to in Cheyenne. And Pa needs help, at least until he's fully recovered. The telegraph office needs an operator. I suppose I'll stay for a while at least. What about you? Are you still heading north? Will was quiet for a long moment. I'm reconsidering my plans. Heard there's ranch work available around here. Nothing as far north as Sundance, but decent wages and honest work. Because of me? Sarah asked, then immediately felt foolish. They'd known each other barely a day. Why would he change his plans for her? But Will didn't laugh or brush off her question. Instead, he set down the dish he'd been drying and turned to face her fully. Yes, because of you. I know it's fast. I know it probably sounds crazy, but Sarah, I've never met anyone like you. Last night, walking with you, talking with you, it felt like finding something I didn't know I'd lost. And I don't want to walk away from that without seeing where it might lead. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. I feel the same way, she admitted. All day, I kept hoping you'd come by, hoping you hadn't left already. I don't understand it, but I feel like I've known you longer than one day. Maybe we have in some way. Maybe some people are just meant to find each other. Will reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch gentle. Can I court you properly, Sarah? Take you to dinner, go for walks, see where this leads? Yes, Sarah said, not even having to think about it. Yes, I'd like that. Over the next few weeks, Will became a constant presence in Sarah's life. He found work at her ranch just outside Lusk, wrangling horses and mending fences. Every evening after work, he'd clean up and come by to see Sarah and check on her father. Thomas grew stronger each day, and Sarah settled into running the telegraph office with Henry's grateful assistance. Will and Sarah fell into a pattern. He'd arrive at dinner time, often bringing something to contribute to the meal, and they'd eat with Thomas. Then Will would help with whatever needed doing around the house, fixing a loose board on the porch, securing a shutter that rattled in the wind, splitting wood for the stove. After Thomas went to bed, Will and Sarah would sit on the porch in the cool evening air and talk. They talked about everything. Their pasts, their dreams, their fears. Will told her about growing up rough after his parents died, bouncing between distant relatives who didn't really want him until he was old enough to work. He told her about his brother, who'd been his best friend, and how losing him had made Will even more determined to live fully, to not waste the time he'd been given. Sarah told him about the loneliness of being a teacher in a city where she never quite fit in, about the students she'd loved, but the society she'd never been part of. She told him about her mother's death and how it had aged her father overnight, how it had made her grow up fast. I think that's why I left for Cheyenne, she admitted one night. I was trying to recapture something I'd lost, some sense of possibility and youth, but I was looking in the wrong place. Where's the right place? Will asked. Sarah looked at him, at his honest face in the moonlight, and smiled. Here, right here. On a Sunday afternoon in early October, Will asked Sarah to go for a ride. Her mare had fully recovered and Will had his bay gelding. They rode out of town toward the open prairie, the autumn sun warm on their faces despite the chill in the air. Will led them to a spot by a small creek where cottonwood trees were turning gold. He spread out a blanket and unpacked sandwiches and apples he'd brought. They ate sitting side by side, watching the water ripple over rocks. I need to tell you something, Will said after they'd finished eating. The foreman at the ranch offered me a permanent position. Year-round work, not just seasonal. It's good pay and there's a small cabin on the property I could use. That's wonderful, Sarah said, meaning it. You'd stay in Lusk then, if you want me to. Sarah, I know we've only known each other a few weeks, but I'm more sure of you than I've been of anything in my life. I love you. I think I started loving you the moment I saw you standing by that lame horse, so determined to get to your father despite everything against you. And every day since, I've loved you more. Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes, but they were good tears, happy tears. I love you too. I think I knew it that first night walking through the dark with you. You made me feel safe and seen in a way I've never felt before. Will took her hand in his. I want to court you properly for as long as you need. I want to do this right, with your father's blessing and the whole town knowing my intentions are honorable. But I also want you to know where I stand. Eventually, when you're ready, I want to marry you. I want to build a life with you here in Lusk or wherever be you want to be. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep beside you every night. I want all of it, Sarah, all of you for all my life. Yes, Sarah said, laughing through her tears. Yes to all of it. I don't need a long courtship, Will. I don't need time to be sure. I'm sure now. I'll marry you whenever you want, as soon as you want. Will pulled her into his arms and kissed her, and Sarah felt like she was finally, truly home. Not because of a place, but because of this man who had walked beside her when she needed him most and had chosen to keep walking beside her every day since. They were married 3 weeks later in a small ceremony at the church in Lusk. Thomas, fully recovered and beaming with pride, walked Sarah down the aisle. Mabel Hughes cried happy tears. The ranch foreman came, along with a few of Will's co-workers and some of the regular customers from the telegraph office. It wasn't a fancy wedding, but it was filled with genuine joy and witnessed by people who cared about them. Sarah wore a simple cream-colored dress that had been her mother's, carefully preserved and altered to fit. Will wore a new suit he'd bought specially for the occasion, his hair trimmed and his face clean-shaven. When they spoke their vows, Sarah's voice was strong and clear, and Will's was thick with emotion. "I promise to walk beside you always," Will said, and Sarah knew he was thinking of that first night, of the choice he'd made to give her his horse and walk. "I promise to be your home," Sarah replied, "wherever our path leads us." They moved into the cabin on the ranch property, and Sarah continued working at the telegraph office part-time, training Henry to take over more responsibilities. Thomas had recovered enough to return to work himself, and he seemed happy to have purpose again, though he'd cut back his hours and let Sarah and Henry handle most of the load. Sarah loved the cabin. It was small, just 2 rooms and a loft, but Will had spent weeks before the wedding fixing it up, patching the roof, building new shutters, whitewashing the walls. Sarah made curtains and bought a rug for the floor and hung her mother's quilt on the bed. She planted herbs in a small garden by the door, even though it was late in the season, thinking ahead to spring. Their life together fell into a rhythm. Will would wake before dawn and head out to work with the horses, always kissing Sarah goodbye before he left. She'd sleep a bit longer, then rise and make breakfast, often walking it out to wherever Will was working if he was close enough. On days she worked at the telegraph office, she'd ride her mare into town and spend the morning there before returning home to cook supper. Will would arrive home in the evening tired and dirty, but his face would light up when he saw her, and he'd sweep her into his arms like he'd been gone weeks instead of hours. In the evenings, they'd sit by the fire and talk, or Will would read aloud from the newspaper while Sarah mended clothes, or they'd simply hold each other in comfortable silence. On Sundays, they'd have dinner with Thomas, and sometimes Mabel would join them. Thomas and Mabel had struck up a friendship that Sarah suspected might turn into something more, and she was glad her father had companionship. Winter came to Wyoming with a vengeance, blanketing everything in snow and bringing temperatures that made Sarah grateful for Will's warmth beside her at night. The ranch work slowed during the coldest months, and Will spent more time at the cabin, fixing things and building furniture. He made Sarah a beautiful chair with a high back and carved armrests, perfect for sitting by the fire. "When did you learn carpentry?" Sarah asked, running her hands over the smooth wood. "Taught myself over the years. Cowboys have a lot of downtime in winter. Some of them drink or gamble. I learned to work with wood," he smiled. "Good thing, too, we'll be needing more furniture before long." Sarah looked at him curiously. "What do you mean?" "Well, I was thinking. This cabin is small, but there's room to add on. I could build another bedroom, maybe 2 if we plan it right." He met her eyes. "For children, Sarah, our children, if that's what you want." Sarah felt her heart swell. They talked about children in abstract terms, but hearing Will speak so concretely about building them a place, planning for their future, made it real. "I want that more than anything. But I should tell you something, I'm already pregnant." Will's eyes widened. "You're sure?" "I'm sure. About 6 weeks along, I think. I was going to tell you tonight. I wanted to wait until I was certain." Will let out a whoop of joy and picked her up, spinning her around until she was dizzy and laughing. We're having a baby. Sarah, we're having a baby, we are. Are you happy? Happy. I'm the happiest man in Wyoming, maybe in the whole world. He set her down carefully, suddenly worried. Are you feeling all right? Should you be riding your horse? Should you be working at the telegraph office? I'm fine, Sarah assured him. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. I'm healthy and strong, and as long as I'm careful, I can keep doing everything I've been doing. At least for now. Will insisted on building the addition to the cabin immediately, despite the winter weather. He worked on it every spare moment, enlisting the help of some of the other ranch hands on their days off. By the time spring arrived and the snow melted, the cabin had 2 new bedrooms and a larger main room with space for a real dining table. Sarah's pregnancy progressed smoothly. She stopped working at the telegraph office in her 6th month, and Henry took over fully with her father's supervision. She spent her days preparing for the baby, sewing tiny clothes and blankets, setting up a cradle Will had built with his own hands. Thomas and Mabel visited often, and Sarah noticed her father seemed younger somehow, lighter. Mabel brought gifts for the baby and advice for Sarah, and the 2 women formed a real friendship. Mabel confessed that she'd been widowed for 15 years and had nearly given up on finding companionship again until she'd met Thomas. Life surprises you, Mabel said, helping Sarah fold baby clothes. Just when you think you know how things will be, something changes. Someone comes along and opens a door you didn't know was there. Sarah thought about Will, about the choice he'd made to help a stranded stranger and how that choice had led to all of this. Her life now was so different from what she'd imagined in Cheyenne, but it was better, truer, more full of love than she'd dreamed possible. In early June of 1884, on a warm afternoon with wildflowers blooming across the prairie, Sarah went into labor. Mabel came to help, along with a midwife from town. Will paced outside the cabin, too anxious to be still, while inside Sarah worked through the pain and fear of bringing new life into the world. It took hours, long, hard hours that tested Sarah's strength and resolve. But finally, as the sun was setting and painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, a baby's cry filled the cabin. Will heard it from outside and nearly ran through the door before Mabel appeared, beaming. "You have a son," she said. "A healthy, strong son, and Sarah's fine. She's tired but fine." Will entered the cabin on shaking legs and found Sarah in bed, pale and exhausted but with a radiant smile on her face. In her arms was a tiny bundle, and when Will looked down at his son's face, he felt something shift in his chest, something fundamental and profound. "He's perfect," Will whispered, reaching out to touch the baby's tiny hand, small fingers wrapped around his thumb, gripping with surprising strength. "He's absolutely perfect. We need to name him," Sarah said. "What do you think?" They discussed names over the winter but never settled on anything. Now, looking at their son, Will thought about the journey that had brought them here, about walking through the darkness, about choosing to help a stranger, about all the small moments that had led to this one. What about Wade? Will suggested. "Wade Thomas Xerxes." "Wade," Sarah repeated, testing it out. "I like it. Strong and simple, and Thomas for my father." "For his grandfather," Will agreed. "Who I hope will teach him to run the telegraph when he's older, just like he taught you." Thomas was overjoyed when they told him the name, and he visited almost daily to see his grandson. Wade was an easy baby, healthy and strong, with his mother's green eyes and his father's dark hair. Will took to fatherhood like he'd been born to it, getting up with Sarah during night feedings, changing diapers without complaint, singing off key lullabies that made Sarah laugh. "Where did you learn that song?" she asked one night, listening to Will's interesting interpretation of a melody. "Made it up," Will admitted. I don't actually know any real lullabies, but Wade doesn't seem to mind. Indeed, their son was sleeping peacefully in Will's arms, tiny face relaxed and trusting. Sarah watched her husband hold their child and felt overwhelmed with love. This man who had walked beside her when she needed him most was now walking beside their son, teaching him through example what it meant to be good and kind and strong. The years that followed were full and rich. Will continued working at the ranch and eventually became foreman, a position he'd earned through hard work and the respect of the other men. Sarah took on occasional work at the telegraph office when her father needed help, bringing Wade along in a basket when he was small and later letting him play quietly in the corner. When Wade was 3, Sarah became pregnant again. This time she knew what to expect, and while the pregnancy was still tiring, she felt more confident. Mabel had married Thomas by then, becoming Sarah's stepmother in fact as well as in spirit, and the extended family gathered around to support them. Their second child was born in the spring of 1887, a daughter with Will's brown eyes and Sarah's auburn hair. They named her Rose Mabel Xerxes, and she was as spirited as her brother was calm. From the moment she could crawl, Rose was into everything, exploring and testing boundaries. Will adored her, his little girl who could already wrap him around her tiny finger. 2 more children followed over the next 5 years. Another son, Jesse, in 1889, and finally another daughter, Lucy, in 1892. The cabin expanded again, with Will and some of the ranch hands building a full second story to accommodate their growing family. What had started as a small 2-room cabin was now a proper house, filled with laughter and noise and life. Sarah sometimes thought back to that day on the road when her horse went lame. She'd been so afraid, so desperate, and she'd felt so alone. And then Will had appeared, offering her not just his horse but his companionship, his strength, his steady presence. He'd walked beside her through the darkness, and he'd been walking beside her ever since. "You ever regret it?" she asked him one evening. They were sitting on the porch, watching their children play in the yard. Wade was 11 now, tall for his age and responsible, helping herd his younger siblings. Rose was 8 and bossing everyone around with the confidence of a natural leader. Jesse at 3 was trying to keep up with his big sister, and baby Lucy was in Sarah's lap, gurgling happily. "Regret what?" Will asked. "Stopping to help me that day, changing all your plans. You were going to head north, work different ranches, keep moving." Will took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "Sarah, that life was just passing time. I didn't know what I was looking for until I found it. Until I found you. And this," he gestured at their children, their home, "this is everything I never knew I wanted. How could I regret finding my purpose?" "I feel the same way," Sarah said softly. "I thought I'd lost everything when I had to leave Cheyenne. My job, my independence, my plans. But I just lost the wrong things. I had to lose them to find the right things. To find you. To find each other," Will corrected. "And to build this life together." Thomas lived to be 74, passing peacefully in his sleep in 1895 with Mabel by his side. He'd been able to see all 4 of his grandchildren grow, to teach Wade the telegraph code just as he'd taught Sarah, to bounce Lucy on his knee and tell her stories of the old mining days. His death was sad but not tragic. He'd lived a full life and died knowing his daughter was happy and loved and cared for. Sarah grieved but found comfort in her family, in Will's arms, in her children's laughter. Mabel stayed close, becoming an even more integral part of their lives, a beloved grandmother to the children. As the 19th century drew to a close, Lusk grew and changed. The telegraph gave way to telephones, and the rough edges of the frontier smoothed into something more settled and civilized. But some things remained constant. The wide Wyoming sky, the wind across the prairie, the ranches and the cattle, and the lives of ordinary people finding extraordinary happiness in simple moments. Will took Wade to work with him at the ranch, teaching his son about horses and cattle, about honest work and keeping your word. Wade soaked it all up, already showing signs of becoming the kind of man his father was. Rose surprised everyone by showing an aptitude for numbers and business. She helped her mother with the household accounts and talked about maybe going to college someday, become a teacher like her mother had been. Jesse was the dreamer of the family, always with his nose in a book or making up elaborate stories to tell his sisters. Lucy was still too young to show her personality fully, but she was already attached to Will, trailing after her father whenever she could and crying when he left for work in the mornings. On a summer evening in 1899, Will and Sarah sat on their porch watching the sunset. The children were inside, supposedly getting ready for bed but more likely playing and gossiping. Sarah leaned against Will's shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of him, leather and hay and sun-warmed skin. "You remember the exact date?" Sarah asked. "When we met?" "September 18th, 1883, Will answered immediately. "I remember because it was 2 days after my 25th birthday. I'd been thinking that day how another year had passed and I was still alone, still drifting. And then there you were. I was 23, so young, really. We were both so young, old enough to know what mattered when we found it." Will kissed the top of her head. 16 years ago. 16 years of waking up next to you. 16 years of building this life. And I'd do it all again in a heartbeat. Even the walking, Sarah teased. All 15 miles. Especially the walking. Best walk I ever took. They sat in comfortable silence as the sky darkened and the stars began to appear. Inside, they could hear their children finally settling down, Wade shushing the younger ones, Rose singing Lucy to sleep. "What do you think about when you look at them?" Sarah asked. "Our children." "I think about how different my life could have been," Will said slowly. "If I'd ridden past you that day, if I'd been less kind or more selfish, I'd have missed all of this. Them. You. Everything that makes life worth living." He paused. "And I think about what I want to teach them, not just ranch work or housekeeping or how to read and write. I want to teach them to help people, to see someone in trouble and stop, to give up their comfort for someone else's need. Because that simple choice, that moment of kindness, it changed everything." "You've already taught them that," Sarah assured him. "Wade helped old Mr. Perkins with his fence last week without being asked. Rose has been tutoring the Bailey girl in arithmetic. Even Jesse shared his favorite book with a friend whose family couldn't afford to buy one. They're learning from your example every day." The sound of a rider approaching made them both turn. A young cowboy reined in his horse at the edge of their property, calling out, "Pardon me, I'm looking for the road north to Newcastle. I think I took a wrong turn somewhere." Will stood and gave the young man clear directions, then added, "It's getting dark. You're welcome to water your horse here and rest a bit before you go on. There's a pump by the barn." "That's mighty kind of you, sir. Thank you." Sarah watched Will help the young cowboy, watched him offer the same casual kindness he'd once offered her, and she felt her heart swell with love and pride. After the cowboy left, directions clear and horse refreshed, Will return to the porch. "Another traveler helped on his way," Sarah said. "You can't seem to help yourself. It's the right thing to do. And besides, you never know how one small kindness might ripple out. Maybe that cowboy will remember this moment someday and help someone else. Maybe that someone else will be important to him, like you were to me." Sarah corrected. "Like I am to you." Will agreed, pulling her into his arms. "Like you are and always will be." Inside, Wade called out that Lucy was asking for her mother. Sarah kissed Will and went inside to their daughter, finding her sitting up in bed with tears on her cheeks. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" "I had a bad dream," Lucy said. "I was lost and alone and scared." Sarah gathered her youngest daughter into her arms. "But you're not lost. You're right here, safe at home. Papa's outside and I'm here, and Wade and Rose and Jesse are just in the next room. You're surrounded by people who love you. You're never alone." "Promise?" Lucy asked, her voice small. "I promise." "And do you know what Papa would say?" "He'd say that even if you were lost, even if you needed help, someone would come along. Because there are good people in the world who help others. Papa's one of them, and we're teaching you and your brother and sisters to be the same." Lucy nodded, reassured, and snuggled back under her blankets. Sarah kissed her forehead and returned to the porch, to Will, to the peaceful evening and the life they'd built together. Years continued to pass in the way they do, measured in small moments and big milestones. Wade grew into a fine young man and took a job managing a ranch east of Lusk. He married a schoolteacher named Emma, and they gave Will and Sarah their first grandchild in 1903. Rose did go to college, one of the first women from Lusk to do so, and came back with a degree in mathematics and a husband she'd met at university. They settled in Lusk and opened a general store that thrived under Rose's sharp business mind. Jesse became a writer, much to everyone's surprise, but not really. He moved to Cheyenne and wrote for the newspaper, sending home copies of his articles and longer stories he was working on. Lucy, the baby, was the one who truly carried on the ranch tradition. She married a rancher's son and they bought land just outside town, building it into one of the most successful operations in the county. Will and Sarah grew older together, their hair turning gray, their faces weathering like the landscape around them. The cabin that had started so small now hosted family gatherings every Sunday, children and grandchildren filling it with noise and love. Sarah would cook with Rose and Emma and Lucy, while the men talked outside and the grandchildren played. It was everything Sarah had never dared to dream of back when she was a lonely teacher in Cheyenne. Mabel passed away in 1905, leaving a hole in their lives but also a legacy of kindness and strength. She'd been a second mother to Sarah and a devoted grandmother to her children. Her funeral was well attended, testament to the lives she'd touched. In 1910, on the anniversary of their meeting, Will took Sarah back to the spot where they'd first encountered each other. It took some doing to find the exact place, as roads had improved and the landscape had changed, but eventually they stood in what they believed was approximately the right location. "It was right about here, wasn't it?" Will said. "Where your mare went lame." "I think so." "It all looks different now, but yes, I think this is close." Sarah looked around at the prairie stretching in all directions. "I remember feeling so desperate, so scared, and then I heard your horse. I remember seeing you and thinking how brave you looked, scared but not defeated. Determined to reach your father no matter what." Will took her hand. 27 years ago, more than half our lives ago now. "The best half," Sarah said, "because of what you did, because you chose to help me." "We chose each other," Will corrected. "I might have made the first move, but you chose to trust me, to open your heart to me. That took courage too." They stood together in the wind, two people who'd built a life on a foundation of kindness and grown it into something remarkable. They'd raised 4 children who were good people, who contributed to their community, who carried forward the values they'd been taught. They'd created a legacy not of wealth or fame, but of love and family and simple goodness. "You think about it often?" Sarah asked. "That night?" "All the time," Will admitted. "Especially when things are hard or I'm facing a difficult choice. I think about deciding to walk so you could ride, about choosing temporary discomfort for someone else's urgent need. It reminds me of the kind of man I want to be." "You are that man," Sarah said firmly. "You've been that man every day since." They returned home as the sun set, riding side by side on horses that were descendants of Will's bay gelding and Sarah's recovered mare. The ranch had bred good stock over the years, and these horses were part of that legacy, carrying them home to the life they'd made. That night, surrounded by family gathered for the anniversary celebration, Will stood and raised his glass. 27 years ago today, I met my wife on a dusty road when her horse went lame. I made a decision that changed my life. I traded my horse for hers and walked beside her to Lusk. It seemed like a simple choice at the time, just the right thing to do. But that choice led to everything I value most. This family, this life, all of you. So I want to say thank you to Sarah for trusting a stranger on a dark road, and thank you to all of you for being part of this journey. To Will and Sarah, Wade said, raising his own glass, and everyone echoed him. Later, after the guests had gone home and the house was quiet, Will and Sarah lay in bed together. Sarah's head rested on Will's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "I love you," she said softly. "I've loved you for 27 years, and I'll love you for however many more we're given." "And I love you," Will replied, his arms tightening around her. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me, the best decision I ever made." "It was a good walk," Sarah said, echoing the joke that had become their private language over the years. "The best walk," Will agreed. "And I'd do it again. I'd walk 1,000 miles if it meant finding you at the end." They fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms. Two people who'd found love in an unexpected place and nurtured it into something that would outlast them both. Their children would tell their children the story of how Grandpa Will walked 15 miles so Grandma Sarah could reach her sick father, and how that act of kindness blossomed into a love story that shaped a family. The years continued their steady march. Will and Sarah celebrated 30 years, then 35, then 40 years of marriage. They slowed down as age demanded, spending more time on the porch watching the world go by and less time working. Will finally retired from the ranch at 65, having spent 40 years working there and 20 of those as foreman. Their children brought grandchildren, who in turn began bringing great-grandchildren. The family tree they'd started on a dark road in 1883 grew branches and spread, touching lives they'd never directly meet, but who carried their legacy nonetheless. In 1923, on a warm September afternoon exactly 40 years after they'd met, Sarah suffered a stroke. Will was beside her immediately, holding her hand and calling for the doctor. She recovered somewhat but was never quite the same, her left side weak and her speech slightly slurred. But her mind remained sharp and her spirit unbroken. Will became her caretaker as she'd once cared for her sick father. He helped her dress and move around the house. He cooked meals and read to her, and never once complained about the role reversal. Their children helped, of course, rotating through to give Will breaks and assist with the heavier tasks. But Will was always there, always by Sarah's side, walking beside her through this new challenge just as he'd walked beside her through so many others. "You don't have to do this," Sarah told him one day, frustrated by her own limitations. "You could hire a nurse. You could let the children take over more." "I know I don't have to," Will said gently. "I want to. Sarah, you are my heart. Taking care of you isn't a burden, it's a privilege. You took care of me for 40 years in 1,000 different ways. Let me do this for you now." Sarah cried then, not from sadness but from overwhelming love. Even now, even after 40 years, this man could still surprise her with the depth of his devotion. They had 3 more good years together. Years measured not in grand adventures but in quiet moments. Morning coffee on the porch, family visits, the simple pleasure of holding hands while watching the sunset. Sarah's health was fragile, but with Will's care and the support of their family, she had more good days than bad. In the summer of 1926, Sarah caught pneumonia. Despite the doctor's best efforts and the family's prayers, she didn't recover. She died on a July evening with Will holding her hand and all 4 children gathered around her bed. Her last words were, "Thank you for walking beside me." Will was lost without her. For the first time in 43 years, he faced the world alone, and it felt impossibly empty. He moved in with Wade and Emma, unable to bear the house he'd shared with Sarah. But everywhere he went, he felt her absence like a physical ache. His children worried about him, watching him grow thin and quiet. But slowly, with time and their support, Will found a way forward. He told stories about Sarah to his grandchildren and great-grandchildren, keeping her memory alive. He talked about that first night, about the choice he'd made, about the love that had grown from a simple act of kindness. "The most important thing I ever did," he'd tell anyone who would listen, "was stop to help a stranger. And the luckiest thing that ever happened to me was that the stranger was Sarah." Will lived 3 more years after Sarah's death. Years he spent being a grandfather and great-grandfather, sharing his stories and his wisdom. He never remarried, never even considered it. Sarah had been his one great love, and he was content with the years they'd had together. On a September evening in 1929, exactly 46 years after he'd met Sarah on a dusty road, Will passed away peacefully in his sleep. He was 71 years old and had lived a full, rich life. The funeral was enormous, attended by children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and half the town of Lusk. Person after person stood up to talk about Will's kindness, his generosity, his quiet strength. Wade told the story of how his parents met, and there wasn't a dry eye in the church. They buried Will next to Sarah under a cottonwood tree at the edge of town. The headstone was simple: Will Xerxes, beloved husband, father, and grandfather, with dates marking his birth and death. But underneath, at Wade's insistence, they added one more line: "He walked beside her." Because that was Will's legacy. Not just that he'd helped Sarah that one night, but that he'd continued to walk beside her every day for the rest of their lives. Through joy and sorrow, through triumph and tragedy, through the everyday moments that make up a life, he'd been there. Present, faithful, loving. Years later, when Wade himself was an old man with grandchildren of his own, he'd take them to visit his parents' graves. He'd tell them the story he'd heard countless times, about a cowboy who traded his horse so a stranded woman could reach her dying father, who walked 15 miles through the darkness just to help a stranger. "And that's how our family began," Wade would say. With one man making the choice to be kind even when it cost him something. Your great-grandfather, Will, was that kind of man. And your great-grandmother, Sarah, was the kind of woman who recognized that kindness and treasured it. They built something beautiful together, and it started with a simple act of compassion on a dark road. The story became family legend, passed down through generations. Will and Sarah's great-great-grandchildren would tell their children about the cowboy who walked beside the stranded woman, and how that walk led to a love that shaped a family and touched countless lives. Because some stories don't end with the people who lived them. Some stories ripple forward, influencing people who never met the original participants, but who carry their values and their love forward into the future. Will and Sarah's story was one of those. It started with a lame horse on a dusty road in Wyoming in 1883, but it didn't end with their deaths. It continued in the lives of their children and grandchildren, in the kindnesses large and small that their descendants showed to others, in the belief that helping a stranger might change your life in ways you can't imagine. And perhaps somewhere in Wyoming, on a modern highway that covers that old dusty road, travelers still pass by the spot where a cowboy once made a choice. The cottonwoods are still there, older and taller now. The creek still flows. The prairie still stretches to the horizon. And if you listen carefully on a quiet evening, maybe you can hear echoes of footsteps, of a man walking beside a horse through the darkness, of two people falling in love one word at a time on a journey that would last forever.